Welcome. I'm Evelyn Farkas, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. Thank you for joining us today for another installment of our Authors and Insight Book Talk series. We are very excited today to host one of our own Board of Trustees members, General David Petraeus, to talk about his latest book co-authored with British historian Andrew Roberts. The book is called Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Exhibit A. General Petraeus thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Let me just give if you don't mind, a quick introduction, although you really don't need one. As most people know, you are a distinguished military leader, a thought leader, a master of command, someone who served over 37 years in the U.S. military, including leading 5 combat commands in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. You've been the head of the Central Command, and of course, upon retirement from the military, you served as the director of the CIA. So you have a long, distinguished background in the military, in the U.S. government. You are now a businessman. You're a partner with the global financial investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. This is all, I think, very much in keeping with your civil military thought leader. We are really grateful that you are still contributing actively through writing, because this is takes a lot of effort on top of your day job. And I want to also comment and thank you for being an original member of the McCain Institute board. The Institute, we focus today on democracy, human rights, and character-driven leadership. It was established by the late senator's family and friends as a way to keep his legacy going. He was still alive in 2012 when you joined the board as one of his close friends and advisors. And we continue to really be grateful that you serve on this board to this very day. And thank you for making yourself available to do this interview.
It's a privilege to be associated with anything that has the name of John McCain on it, but especially the McCain Institute. I remember being the very first individual interviewed by him on stage at the very first Sedona Forum, the inaugural event of the McCain, what became known as the McCain Institute. And again, it's been a privilege to be associated with it and contribute to it ever since. And thanks for your leadership of this great organization.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your support. So first, I think the best question to start with always is, why did you write this book?
Well, because Andrew Roberts called up and proposed that we should write a book. Right after the Russians invaded Ukraine the latest time, he called up with longtime friends. We've done lots together on stages in New York and at the Cliveden Literary Festival and various venues in London. I am a huge admirer of him. This is his 20th book, in fact, well known for the biographies of Churchill and Napoleon and Masters and Commanders and the Last King of America and so forth. And he called up and said, there's not a book that provides the military historical context for Ukraine. Would you like to write it with me? And I jumped at the chance. This is the first book he's ever co-authored, by the way. I jumped at the chance because I've been looking for an opportunity to write about Iraq and Afghanistan without doing a kind of tell-all memoir, just to do the military history of those. Iraq in particular, I was literally there for the invasion. 2-star came back as a 3-star, had a 3-star break, did the counterinsurgency field manual, overhauled all our preparation for deployment to Iraq, then did the surge in Iraq, then Central Command, and eventually CIA, all during the time that we were actively involved there before the withdrawal of our final combat forces in late 2011. And then Afghanistan, of course, the commander, Central Command, and actually did an assessment there as a 3-star as well for Secretary Rumsfeld, and then CIA director. So I wanted to try to distill the thoughts there and what we should learn from those experiences. And then also to revisit Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton at about the 10-year mark after the South collapsed, but with many more decades since, in which there was additional scholarship, more memoirs, declassification of innumerable documents, and so on. And then also to lay out the intellectual construct for strategic leadership that I think is hugely important in any endeavor, whether it's private sector, nonprofit, or conflict, and then to look at these different conflicts through the prism that that particular intellectual construct provides. So again, I was delighted to do this. I had huge admiration for Andrew before. I have even more since working with him. This is a product of tens of thousands, actually, of emails back and forth as we wrote and rewrote and edited each other's work. I remember HarperCollins won the bidding war, which was great, lovely advance and so forth, which I gave all of mine to veterans organizations. But we had the first video conference with the individual who's the editor. And he said, now, how do you propose to go about writing this? You know, Roberts, we know you can produce. Petraeus, well, you did this dissertation and a field manual and you were a speechwriter, but again, how's this going to work? And Andrew immediately said, well, General Petraeus is going to write the chapters about the countries he invaded. And he said, I'll fill in the rest. And it was sort of how it worked, although the collaboration was very, very considerable throughout the entire book. But it was a really a joy. I mean, it's very, very hard work, an extraordinary amount of research and so on, but a real pleasure.
That's nice. Well, so the book, as you noted to me before we got on to the recording, has made the New York Times bestseller list. So people are reading it. Exactly. Congratulations.
I mean, for
And
military history to make the New York Times bestseller list is not, unless it's, you know, written by some famous journalist.
right. And so I want to talk to you about that because it is a military history. So people who care about military history, people who care about history should read the book. But it's more than that, right? You guys have a thesis in here and you talk about the importance of strategic leadership. You're looking at these conflicts, you're looking at this history. And by the way, you're not looking at all history since 1945. You very consciously plucked, you decided which ones you wanted to focus on. So can you talk a little bit about how you picked the cases that you look at and your general thesis? What is strategic leadership and why is it so important that Americans and others around the world read your history through that prism?
Well, we picked the conflicts, the wars that most advance the evolution of warfare, since of course that's the topic of the book. And you can argue that there should be this or that in there, and perhaps these others were not that significant. But again, we went through that particular process because otherwise the book would be endless. It's substantial as it is. And the second edition, which we just sent to the editor, will have another chapter, a chapter on Gaza and the greater Middle East, and also an update to the Ukraine chapter as well, and to the future of warfare chapter. But the use of this intellectual construct for strategic leadership is very deliberate, and it's based on our assessment that that is the most important component that determines success or failure in war, the quality of the strategic leadership. This is a construct that I developed between the 3- and 4-star tours that I had in Iraq. I used it explicitly during the surge in Iraq at U.S. Central Command, in Afghanistan, CIA, and beyond, because it's very applicable, again, to the business world, to the private sector, and so forth. The leader at the very top, and here we pretty quickly focus after, say, a president or a prime minister makes the decision to go to war, we then focus on the theater commander, if you will, the commander of multinational forces in Iraq or the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. That leader has to perform 4 tasks superbly if that side is to prevail. You have to get the big ideas right. That's first and foremost. Without this, all else doesn't matter. You have to craft the right strategy. And in conflict, that means understanding your forces and their capabilities and limitations, strengths and weaknesses, and all the coalition elements in it as well. It includes an assessment of the enemy forces and, again, their conduct, their capabilities. It includes an understanding of the human terrain in the area of operations, the physical terrain, needless to say, as well, how a country is supposed to operate, how it really functions, all the elements of society in that particular area of operations, the neighborhood, and all the other forces at play, and then crafting the right strategy, getting the campaign design right. The second task is to communicate the big ideas effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, and to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. So that includes America's mothers and fathers, coalition soldier mothers and fathers, the host nation government, forces, counterparts, the enemy, uh, number 10 Downing Street, the White House, the Pentagon, everyone again, and you've got to communicate this effectively, including, again, our very troops. And I actually developed my own counterinsurgency guidance, and every 6 weeks or so, I would update it, hit the send key, and it would go out to everyone so that they understood the big ideas at my level and could then try to put them, operationalize them, if you will, going outside the wire, under body armor and Kevlar, doing what only they can do, which is to engage the enemy and also to engage the population. The third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the example the leader provides, the inspiration, the energy. It's attracting the best and brightest and hanging on to them as long as you can and developing them and taking care of them. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you craft to implement this strategy that you have developed. It's the metrics that you use. And by the way, the body count, for example, in Vietnam was a terribly flawed metric, in part because it was tied to a terribly flawed big idea, which is that we could win a war of attrition against the North Vietnamese, which was very flawed. We were thrashing around in the jungle with big units trying to find this very elusive enemy. When we did find them, yes, we inflicted considerable casualties on them, although we also did enormous damage in the areas of these operations. Instead of focusing on security of the people in the villages and hamlets, which is what the South Vietnamese government wanted help doing, all the way from when we came in after the withdrawal of the French from Indochina, after the abysmal defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Talk about a bad big idea. Dien Bien Phu was exemplary of that in a big way. So you've got to get the right metrics. And then you also have to have a battle rhythm. How do you spend your time? That's how you drive the execution of a campaign plan. It's the meetings that you hold. It's the recurring events. It's what you do every day of the week, several times a week, twice a week, once a week. The video conference that the President of the United States ran with Ambassador Crocker and me every Monday morning Eastern Standard Time, 7:30 to 8:30. Imagine that. Nothing happens in the White House before 10 usually. And there it is, 7:30 with the whole national security team around the table on a Monday morning. That's how President Bush started the week. That sends a powerful message. Tuesday morning, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, Secretary of Defense and the chairman with me. The national security meeting of the Iraqi prime minister. Ambassador and I, an hour with the prime minister every week. Multiple trips out to go on patrol with our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, outside the wire, experiencing a bit of what they experienced, to get a feel for that myself. On and on. All of these different activities have to be on that battle rhythm. The frequency of the meetings, the substance of them, the subject, and all the rest of this is how you actually, again, drive the implementation of a campaign plan. And then there's a fourth task, which is sometimes overlooked at the peril, and that is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the context evolves, as the situation evolves. And to enable that, or to force that, you actually have events on your battle rhythm, particular meetings and so forth, that will enable you to hear from those who are out looking for lessons that need to be learned, but aren't learned until they're actually incorporated in the big ideas, communicated, and then executed, and so forth. So all of these tasks, these four tasks, are absolutely crucial. The most important, though, is getting the big ideas right. Again, in Vietnam, it took us 13 years to realize that we could not win this search and destroy campaign against the North, a war of attrition, that we should have been focused on security and service of the people. Then the enemy would come to us. But it was not until late 1968, with General Abrams taking over from General Westmoreland, that that was finally actually developed and then implemented, but undermined dramatically by what had happened earlier in 1968 with the Tet Offensive, where public opinion had degraded so quickly that it was not possible to implement what finally was the sensible strategy for that war. It took us 9 years in Afghanistan, not just to get the big ideas right. That was probably about the 8-year mark with General McChrystal, but all the other inputs, almost the right level of forces, the right organizational architecture, the right level of of other elements, diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law experts, forensic, financial, all of this, and the right preparation of our forces, the right individual leaders, all of that, again, took us 9 years. I happened to be the commander by that point in time, but we only kept it right for about 6 months before we started a drawdown that increasingly in subsequent years was much more keyed to the political timeline in Washington, rather than the reality on the ground in Afghanistan, as was the case with the drawdown of the surge in Iraq, where the president empowered me and even extended Army soldiers for 12 to 15 months in tours and so forth. It took us years to get it right in Iraq. 2006, we were essentially clearing and leaving areas, getting out of the neighborhoods as violence was going up at a very, very alarming level, because the country was in the early stages of a Sunni Shia civil war, which was full blown by the time we launched the surge. And when we reversed the big ideas by 180 degrees to go back into the neighborhoods, establish 77 different locations for our forces, to create gated communities, biometric ID cards, all of these different tactics, techniques, and procedures that enabled us to drive violence down by nearly 90%. And of course, with the steadfast support of Senator McCain throughout that time, who famously said that year, he was a candidate for
Yeah.
president, of course, and he famously said that he would rather lose an election than lose in a war. And that's why he was standing firmly behind the surge. Together with Senators Lieberman and Graham, we called them the Three Amigos, the only really strong supporters in the Senate at a time where the support for the war hung by one or two away from seeing cloture that could have actually resulted in a vote that would have constrained or defunded the war in some ways. So, and he would come out and visit all the time. By the way, I spent something like 8 of my final 11 4th of July deployed. And Senator
Wow.
McCain was at just about every one of the 4th of July ceremonies that we would have, which were re-enlistment ceremonies and American citizenship ceremonies, and very moving, at which he always spoke. So again, this model is crucial. We look at it for a number of these different conflicts, some of them where the strategic leadership is very impressive, the Falklands, Malaysia, Oman, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Panama, and then others where the performance is more uneven or even inadequate. Again, the French in Indochina,
Yeah.
French in Algeria, Americans in Vietnam, and then this back and forth, if you will, in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'll end by just noting that, the invasion of Iraq, and I was part of that as a 2-star general. I was the commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division, and extraordinary campaign to topple the Saddam Hussein regime. But again, following that, the big ideas were very, very inadequate, initially inadequate, and then terribly flawed. When the Coalition Provisional Authority was established as a pickup team, replacing another pickup team, the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, when it disappointed the Secretary of Defense, the first 2 actions taken by the new CPA administrator were to fire the Iraqi military without telling them how we're going to enable them to provide for their families and themselves, and then to compound that by firing the Ba'ath Party all the way down to the level of the bureaucrats, tens of thousands of them that we needed to help run a country we didn't sufficiently understand, without an agreed reconciliation process. Those 2 actions thrust the country into a huge challenge, where the seeds of the insurgency that we saw in the subsequent months and years, and created hundreds of thousands of individuals, many of them trained soldiers with weapons, whose incentive, their incentive was to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it, because of actions that we took. One of I always had on a wall, I always had a sign on the walls of my operations center in these 5 combat commands, a question that was staring me in the face. And it asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, in other words, it's going to create more bad guys because of its conduct than it takes off the street, you're supposed to retool it so you can get to yes. And if you can't get to yes, you're supposed to sit under a tree until the thought passes. The same is true of policies. And very clearly, the CPA head should have sat under a tree until those 2 thoughts passed, because they were enormously destructive. And it took us years to recover somewhat from them. In fact, it was during the surge that we finally had a fully functioning reconciliation process throughout these Sunni areas. Most of these were Sunni. And then also finally had the kind of industrial strength train and equip mission, which I coincidentally helped to establish when I came back as a 3-star not long after coming home as a 2-star. So this intellectual construct is, as you noted, as I noted, the prism through which we examine these different conflicts. And it's pretty indicative of which side ends up prevailing in a particular conflict.
Yeah, I think those 2 chapters in particular on Afghanistan and Iraq, for those of us who lived through it, and I was a senior staffer on the Senate Armed Services Committee, you do a fantastic job of encapsulating really the weaknesses. I think even those who oppose the war in Iraq might have supported it if there was a plan, post invasion. If all of the that you just listed and you have in the chapter on Iraq had not occurred, meaning all of the mistakes the civilians made, frankly, not the military, if those mistakes had not been made, if somehow there was an understanding that now if we were going to take out Saddam Hussein, we had to replace it with some sort of regime that included bureaucrats, that you couldn't de-Baathify all the way down to the last janitor, and that the people had to be offered some sort of vision of the future and some sort of political bargain.
No, absolutely. And by the way, we also should have established an embassy right away. I've never been able to fully understand why we created these 2 pickup teams. And of course, the CPA then is the way the country largely was administered for the subsequent 15 months or so until we actually established an embassy and had an interim Iraqi government. The only explanation I can come up with is that that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld wanted to try to run the war more than he would have been able to if there was an embassy, which naturally would have reported to the Secretary of State. Again, can't prove that, have not been able to do that. But that seems to be the only plausible explanation. And then, unfortunately, this became a revolving door. Very few of the people at CPA, the exception of Ambassador Bremer, who stayed the whole way commendably, but very few of the other people stayed more than 3 to 6 months. And so you just build a relationship with somebody who's helping revive at the Ministry of Higher Education or Finance or what have you, because I was responsible for Northern Iraq by then. And I had no civilian help whatsoever. So we had to assume all tasks. All the NGOs went back, left after the bombing of the UN compound and the killing of Sergio de Mello, the UN special representative. Again, the big ideas on the organization here really were very, very lacking.
Yeah. So we have about a half an hour left. So I want to turn to the present, if I can, and ask you to apply some of this, some of your lessons learned about the big ideas and strategic leadership to current events. I just returned from about a week in Israel. We went down to the border with Gaza. I also went around the West Bank. I guess let's start with Gaza. Is Israel getting the big ideas right in Gaza? Obviously, they have an objective, which is to destroy Hamas. That is a big idea. But in the pursuit of that big idea, they're killing civilians. They're losing the PR, campaign, if you will. And ultimately, they don't seem to have an end state, an end goal that's tenable, and certainly not compatible if you want to eradicate Hamas and bring the hostages home and have a peace there. Those 3 things don't seem to be lining up. So can you talk a little bit about, really just answer the question of whether Israel's getting the big ideas right in Gaza?
Yeah, and what you mentioned is actually an objective, which is to destroy Hamas. And destruction in military doctrine terms means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. And their campaign is not preventing Hamas from reconstituting. They're employing a clear and leave strategy, similar, frankly, to what we did during 2006 in Iraq prior to the surge. And of course, the effects are ephemeral. Yes, you degrade the enemy and you can continue to degrade the enemy, But ultimately, when you pull out, the enemy reconstitutes itself to a degree, considerable degree in some cases, requiring Israelis to go back into areas of northern Iraq multiple times. A Shifa hospital they've had to do more than once, and so on. And then the other objective, which is to prevent Hamas from governing Gaza again. Again, the only way you can do that is if you support some kind of alternative structure and help establish it. But if you leave, again, you're leaving a vacuum. Hamas and also criminal elements and also some remnants of the Palestinian
Right.
Islamic Jihad are the ones that are coming together, and you have a little bit of a Mad Max scenario here, where the guys with guns are sort of controlling it, and the lives of the Palestinians are very, very tenuous right now. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, as you noted, and there has been enormous destruction in the conduct of this campaign. Reportedly, half of the structures literally have been damaged or destroyed. Millions of people, well over 1 million people displaced, and so on. An inadequate amount of humanitarian assistance going in. By the way, not for lack of trucks, frankly, it's for lack of security. Again,
That's right.
the lesson of the surge in Iraq is that without security, nothing is possible. With it, everything is possible. There's a famous observation by one of the long-serving individuals in Vietnam, John Paul Van, who is almost a metaphor for the war, and a tremendous book about him, I might note, that is, again, really encapsulates the good and the bad
It's
of
somewhere on
Vietnam.
my shelves here.
It's a great one. So he was fond of saying security may be the first 10% or the first 90%. Whatever it is, it's the first 10% or the first 90%. That is, without that, nothing, again, is possible. So in this case, the campaign design, the big idea, the strategy is not adequate. Clear and leave is not sufficient. Again, if they truly intend to destroy Hamas and prevent them from governing again, if they're shifting to something else, then that would be different. Although I don't think that would be an adequate result. I think it would be very flawed. Keep in mind that Hamas is akin to the Islamic State. This is an Islamist extremist organization. It's not reconcilable the way we reconciled with 103,000 of those that had been fighting us in Iraq, but many of them were sort of the chameleons. They weren't Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was irreconcilable. There's only one thing you can do with them, and that is capture them or kill them. And that should be what is done to Hamas. That's what destruction would entail. That's what we did do to Al-Qaeda, was destroy them during the course of the surge and keep them destroyed for the subsequent 3.5 or more years until our final combat forces pulled out and the Iraqi prime minister took highly sectarian actions that allowed the Al-Qaeda elements, by then the Islamic State, to reconstitute themselves and eventually establish the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in modern times. So in this case, what you have to do would be clear, hold, and build operations. This is very difficult. It's very resource intensive. I understand why the Israelis would shrink from this. The problem is I see no alternative. I mean, people blithely put forward, well, we need an Arab force. There's no Arab force that's going to come in and
Right.
do the hard edge. You have to go to war with Hamas if you're going to establish security. And that is tough. It's hard. And there's not the capacity in the region. I've just been in the Gulf states twice. There's no one at all raising a hand saying, yeah, we'll go in there and do the hard edge work for you. But if you do achieve security, then you could get, I think, Arab forces in. You could get Palestinian elements in there. You could get elements of the Palestinian Authority in there. So how to go about this in a way that you can't take it all on at once, what I've suggested, and you saw the article in foreignaffairs.com recently with Megan O'Sullivan and Richard Fontaine, both of whom were heavily engaged in this back during the surge, just come in a mile from the north, put an east-west wall. It's only 7-8 miles, something like that. We put up that amount of concrete every single night during the surge because you're creating gated communities. That's how you actually secure an area. And then 2 north-south, so you have 3 gated communities now. You clear them very, very painstakingly, every building, floor, room, tunnel entrance, etc. Only people allowed in there are those with biometric ID cards, which was what we used during the surge in Iraq, a variety of other techniques. Entry control points that go to the rest of Gaza so that people can return to their homes now that the areas are secured. And these are very, very, you have X-ray machines, you have bomb sniffing dogs, so you can't have explosives or whatever go in there. You have to have chicanes, prevent suicide bombers, which we might see at some point, all of this. And once you've done that, then by the way, you have entry control points from Israel into these three neighborhoods. You can flood them with humanitarian assistance. You can begin the process of restoration of basic services, reconstruction. You're showing that you are actually committed to a better life for the Palestinian people, which should be one of the objectives if you're trying to keep Hamas from being attractive to the people again. You can gradually introduce contractors. NGOs can come in now and function because it's secure and organized. You can get some local partners, presumably bring in some outside Palestinian, maybe some Arab forces to help you out as well, to thin out the Israeli forces. And then you do it again, go another mile or two. Again, keep in mind, the whole thing is only, I don't know, 12, 15 miles from
The
north to
size
south.
of New Jersey.
Oh, it's much smaller than that. I mean,
Or even smaller than
it's much, much smaller than that. Again, it's a
actually,
very modest size.
you're
Population density is considerable, and the
right.
tunnels are very formidable. So it's a fiendishly difficult urban setting, but this is the way to do that, and then just keep working your way down. And by the way, then you truly will have destroyed Hamas. They have not destroyed Hamas. There's at least 3 battalions still left in the south. The leadership is certainly still alive. Again, if you really intend to destroy Hamas, which I believe is the right objective, and to keep them from governing or ruling or controlling the territory again, there is no alternative to this approach. Again, I understand why, I guess, why the U.S. is against them reoccupying, although I think it's wrong. I understand certainly why the Israelis are reluctant to do it, given the small size of their standing force, the amount of reserves they'd have to call up, the impact on the economy, and frankly, their focus on Hezbollah, which they want to push back north of the Litani River to push them out of range of the 107, 122 millimeter rockets that are so ubiquitous, and along with drones and other missiles have forced 70,000 Israelis to evacuate from their homes and villages. But when it comes to Gaza, I see no alternative to this particular approach. This is, in essence, what we did during the surge. It is a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, and that's what they're facing now. It's guerrillas. It's not organized units to the extent that they were earlier, and they're diminished in their capabilities, but they're still quite formidable. And the terrain is very, very challenging, again, given the density of the population, use of civilians as human shields, the fact they still hold well over 100 hostages, and the 350 miles of tunnel, many tens of miles at least, still functioning in existence. But I just don't see an alternative to that particular approach. And if they do not adopt that, then what you're going to have is they'll hermetically seal, especially now that they control the Philadelphia corridor, the southern border with Egypt, and the Rafah crossing down there. They can limit very considerably what might get into Gaza. They can do punitive raids to degrade further Hamas, but that doesn't destroy Hamas, and it doesn't prevent Hamas from reconstituting, and it certainly doesn't take care of the people in the way that the Geneva Convention would require. You can argue whether they are literally the occupiers or not. I think when you take down the existing government, de facto, you break it, you own it. The old Pottery House rules that I think Colin Powell observed. But again, I just don't see an alternative. For all those that see deficiencies in this, I acknowledge it, but I think there's no other viable alternative at this moment in time. And I think there should be a commitment broadly, not just in, by the way, Gaza, but also in the West Bank, to improving life for the Palestinian people. And at some point in time, doing re-education and moderation and all the rest of this, so that they can actually live together.
I wanted to actually ask you about the West Bank, but I will say I did mention your very wise, I mean, these points that you made about clearing and holding to many Israeli generals or former generals. So hopefully they will be curious and calling you. I don't know. There wasn't a lot of receptivity, but as you said, they have this idea that they don't want to reoccupy. If they can get over that, as you laid out, there's a chance then for real security.
Well, look, the Minister of Defense is keenly aware of what I've just laid out. I can verify that or validate that. And but again, there are challenges without question.
Yeah,
I understand the reluctance to do it. I just don't see any alternative. There's nothing
right.
else viable out there. And therefore, I think the sooner that this is tried, just try it, go a mile
Yeah,
in, see how
yeah,
it works out, learn from it. The problem is that they have no experience doing this. They're like our forces were, frankly, prior to, say, the surge in Iraq. They don't have a counterinsurgency field manual. We didn't have one until 2006 when I was back in the States and we wrote it. The preparation of the forces is not there. They've never trained on it. They have no history of doing this. They might say that, well, we did this in Lebanon decades ago. Not quite. They didn't create gated communities. They didn't do the real security, and it's a much larger area than is the Gaza
and
territory.
unfortunately, to the extent that they have experience with occupying, what they have is the West Bank experience, which, I think having gone through a tour and seeing what they're doing and talking to former IDF soldiers, it is not effective right now. They are just trying to keep the civilians off balance. And then the settlers, with IDF support now with this government, are essentially bulldozing villages, pushing Palestinians out. It doesn't seem to be tenable, or at least compatible with the big idea of Israel, which is a Jewish democratic state. It seemed to those of us really looking at the latest developments in the West Bank and the latest actions of the settlers and the far right, to really potentially, if pushed to the extreme, put the whole idea of the Jewish democratic state at risk. So I wonder what you would say in that about the West Bank.
The big idea I've felt for some time when it comes to the so-called Palestinian issue, if you will, has been that, okay, I got it. The time is not right. Neither leaders on the Palestinian side nor the Israeli side can make the kind of concessions necessary to establish and implement a true two-state solution, but at least don't create more obstacles to the eventual pursuit of such a solution. And I think what you've laid out are actions that are creating more obstacles. And I think you have to ask, how do you answer that question that was on my wall? Will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And so I think that's the challenge that you see here. I'm very sensitive to the fact that they certainly need to carry out counterterrorism operations there. And again, there is an occupation in a way, but keep in mind that the Palestinian security forces, by and large, are responsible for security on the ground. There's actually a degree of coordination that's publicly known between the IDF and those elements. But again, if you come back to the issues that you raised, again, I think they are creating more obstacles and are violating that particular question that was on my wall staring me in the face during these 5 combat commands.
Yeah, the problem is, of course, de facto, the IDF really is the security force. And so it doesn't work out under this particular leadership, given the guidance to the IDF. So in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we are able to cover Ukraine. You have a whole chapter about Ukraine. You do a great job pointing out, of course, the strategic leadership there, which is not in Russia, but in Kyiv in Ukraine. And you mentioned that there are some lessons for Taiwan. So if I can ask you to talk about Ukraine, what the lessons are, and then kind of pivot so that we make sure we have a little bit of lessons for fun.
Well, certainly first year and a half, absolutely. The strategic leadership in Kyiv was vastly better than that in Moscow. If you think about what was the big idea of President Zelensky at the outset, it's, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to fight for Kyiv. This is our war of independence. No men are going to leave Ukraine. All of these. And then, of course, his communication skills were incredible. He was, after all, an actor, a comedian who played the president so effectively that he became the president. He had these differentiated messages, very skillfully delivered for all the different countries that were supporting Ukraine. His oversight of the implementation of the big ideas. You know, he's out on the front lines. Putin's at the end of a long marble table. All of this just compare and contrast, and then refining the big ideas and so forth. But unfortunately, there are objective realities that even great strategic leadership has to deal with. And one of those is the fact that Russia has, who knows now, I mean, originally it was a 3-to-1 population advantage, but given the exodus of Ukrainians and so forth, it's probably 4-to-1 manpower. It might even be 5-to-1 at this point in time. And an economy that's 10 times the size of Ukraine's. And unfortunately, Putin's sort of gotten the big ideas right for reviving his military industrial complex, getting components from China, ammunition from North Korea, drones from Iran, and the rest of this. And then the Russians have been learning as well. The defenses they established in the south proved to be far more formidable than was anticipated. And again, their use of manpower, which they recruit with extraordinary enlistment bonuses and death gratuities out in rural areas. They're not, the burden of this war is not falling on the elite, the sons and daughters of the elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's the rural areas who are being recruited and used in human wave attacks. The problem is that sort of works, and just throwing massive quantities of artillery, glide bombs now, and other missiles and so forth at the Ukrainians, going after their energy generation. It's going to be a cold winter this year in Ukraine. There are already outages of 12 hours a day in certain areas, especially where they've taken out the hydroelectric generation. You can't repair that overnight or even over months. So again, the Russians gained a bit of momentum. They still have a bit of that while the U.S. dithered in the House of Representatives for 6 months over whether to provide additional assistance. Ultimately, it did. 61 billion is a huge amount compared with 44 billion provided over the first 2 years of the war. But there are also issues that Ukraine had to deal with, and it took them a bit longer than should have. And one of those is the forced generation, essentially the conscription process. The average age of a soldier in front lines in Ukraine is over 40. It was 19 to 22 in the wars I was privileged to command. And they've now made changes to their conscription law. Now they have to get on with the forced generation process and make up for lost time, actually, to try to counter what Russia has and is throwing at them. And quantity does have a quality of its own, even if it's poorly trained and equipped and just used in human wave attacks. They have, and big lessons have to do with technology. It's incredible that Ukraine, without a navy, essentially, has been able to sink 40% of the Russian Black Sea fleet and force them out of the Western Black Sea, including evacuating the centuries-old port of Sevastopol in Western Crimea. And it's by use of aerial drones to find the ships, maritime drones to blow them up, sometimes anti-ship missiles as well, although they're now generally well beyond the range of those. And this has opened up the Western Black Sea so that Ukraine can export grain to countries like Egypt and North Africa that depend on Ukrainian exports for their food security. Noting Ukrainian exports are almost 25% of the world's exports of various types of grain. So that's an extraordinary achievement. On land, Ukraine this year will ultimately produce 1 million drones in a year. And they're throwing thousands of the Russians at the front lines, and then also many dozens each night into Russian territory. And in their case, they're going after Russian refineries, trying to keep the Russians from being able to refuel their forces deployed in and around Ukraine, and also to destroy critical infrastructure, airfields, critical capabilities, some of the more high-end aircraft and so on. And they're doing generally very impressively with that, though the Russians, again, are getting better at air defense and electronic warfare, and this goes back and forth. So the technological element here is dramatically different from any war in the past. And of course, it's carried out in a context that is different from any war in the past as well, because of the enormous transparency from the ubiquitous presence of smartphones. Anybody can take a photo, film, a video, the internet access, Starlink, among other ways, and then social media onto which you can upload Again, these videos, photos, statements, whatever it may be. So this has a lot of lessons for the future, but particularly the imperative for all forces over time to transition from a small number of large platforms that are very capable, heavily manned, incredibly expensive, and increasingly vulnerable because they can be seen. And if you can be seen, you can be hit. If you can be hit, you can be killed. Yes, you prove the defenses, it's all that. But in a very high-end war, you've got to be prepared for that. And you need to transition, therefore, from the small number of large platforms to a massive number of smaller platforms, increasingly number of which will not be remotely piloted, will be autonomously piloted, enabled by artificial intelligence, where the human in the loop becomes the human on the loop, the human who actually designs the algorithm and captures the direction, the instructions for that particular unmanned system. And this is not just in the air. It's also going to be on the ground. It'll be on the surface of the sea, subsea, which still has a degree of opaque degree to it. Outer space, cyberspace, all of these operating simultaneously. And you ask, what are the lessons for Taiwan? These are among the lessons. Also being much more serious about the capabilities of their forces, longer enlistment periods, further reserve training and time, and all the other actions that this would guide them and us to in the Indo-Pacific region, keeping in mind that what we wanted to do is deter a conflict there. And deterrence has two components. One is the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand. The other is the potential adversary's assessment of your willingness to employ those capabilities. And in the book, we repeatedly note that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. If you have a red line in Syria that turns out not to be a red line, that undermines perceptions out in the Indo-Pacific about your willingness to employ the forces that you have. In fact, I remember I was with the Prime Minister in Singapore when that happened, and he said, General, there's repercussions out here for that kind of activity. I think that the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, following through the agreement that the previous administration made with the Taliban, was one of the factors that led Putin to think, those Americans, they're not going to respond strongly to this. Look, they withdrew from a country. They only had 3,500 troops. There hadn't been a soldier killed in 18 months. Very sustainable policy, not satisfactory, to be sure. It was frustrating. It wasn't what we hoped it would be. Our partners were not always what we hoped they would be, but nonetheless, vastly better than what was very predictable and was predicted. I said I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces, not because of the withdrawal of our forces, but because of the withdrawal of the 17,000 Western contractors that were needed to maintain the sophisticated helicopters and planes that were the linchpin of the entire strategy, which is to get the commandos, well-trained, well-equipped, 35,000 strong, from their different locations around the country to the front lines where the Taliban are attacking the lightly armed and lightly trained police and soldiers to reinforce them, something that had worked quite well. But the minute the contractors pulled out, the air mobility degraded quite rapidly. Pretty soon, the Afghan soldiers know nobody's coming to the rescue. And unlike the past, when they fought very hard and took many, many times the losses that we did in 20 years, all of a sudden you saw them collapse.
Yeah, there's so much in there and we don't have much time, but I did have a question. We got a question from one of our former McCain global leaders about deterrence, because she was understanding that political will is really important, and the perception you just laid out that Putin had probably was that we were not going to stand up to him and we were not going to back Ukraine the way that we did. And he was probably given that perception also by his intel folks. But this our former global leader, Lisa Pass, she wants to know, how can you deter thugs like Putin, who will only be deterred, in her reading, if we take a punch or a potential escalatory step first?
Well, first of all,
I don't know if you agree with that.
There should be no doubt about your willingness to use your forces, and there should be no question about the capability of those forces, for starters. That doesn't mean that you have to engage directly. In fact, I agree with the administration that we should not be engaging directly with Russia. but we should be doing more to enable Ukraine. I think we actually have responded impressively in general, set a good leadership, if you will, for NATO countries, prevented Putin from driving a wedge between Europe and North America, East and West Europe, substantial amount of assistance. No one else can do what it is that we can do and have done. But we also delayed critical decisions far too long. The M1 tanks, which meant they weren't there for the summer counteroffensive last year. That delayed the German decision to allow countries to send their Leopards there. They weren't there in sufficient time. Western aircraft, it was inevitable. They'd run out of MiGs. Every NATO country that had MiGs had given them to Ukraine. Ukraine can't make any more of them. And so it was inevitable that you had to go in, most likely to F-16s or alternatives, but the ubiquitous nature of F-16s meant that that should be the platform. And again, that's taken far too long. The decision on the longer range Army tactical missile system took too long. We're still constraining its use on Russian soil. So while there in general has been an impressive response led by the US and very impressive by the EU in aggregate and European countries individually, they're much more serious about this than at any time in the past in the Cold War, post-Cold War era. We've again undermined some of this by over hesitation, concerns about escalation that I think were legitimate in the beginning, but not anymore, and so forth. So that has to do with deterrence. Again, if you send a very clear message, that ensures that the potential adversary's assessment of your willingness to use your forces is not wanting. And of course, you do have to transform your force. And we're doing a lot of that in the Indo-Pacific. We are dispersing our forces. We are hardening our bases, headquarters going underground, improving the defenses, shoring up relationships with allies like the Philippines, AUKUS, Japan increasing its defense spending by doubling it in 5 years, on and on. All these different actions contribute to deterrence, but we should accelerate that transformation I mentioned earlier from, again, a small number of large platforms to a massive number of small unmanned systems.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much in this great book. I also want to just remark, I very much appreciated a couple of comments you made towards the end when you were kind of wrapping up with your co-author. You said, no great power can be isolationist. John McCain would be smiling down at you for saying that. You know, isolationism, it does make America weaker. You also talked about another thing that he would have very much agreed with: never underestimate the moral component and the role of morale in war. And of course, that came out loud and clear, especially in that Ukraine chapter. So there's a lot in this book, and we are really grateful that you spent some time with us today, General, to talk about this excellent book. For our virtual guests, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the program. We encourage you to buy your copy of Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. It's available everywhere. And please be sure to follow our social media at McCain Institute, and go to our website for updates on our next installment of Authors and Insights. The website's mccaininstitute.org. And thank you again for your time and your attention.
Thanks, Evelyn. Great to be with you.
Thank you, General. Take care.